Now, we had reached in our meditations the fifth commandment. And I had explained to you that it's important to remember that just because something looks like a forbidden action or a sin does not mean that it is. It's important to relate this to what the action is about. So I had used the example because murder, which is prescribed, it's forbidden by the fifth commandment, first of all, is based in the right to life, which is based in the fact that we all have an immortal soul. Though you can be cruel to animals, you can't murder them because they have no right to life, because they don't have an immortal soul. That's the key. And the right to life is the foundation of all the other rights, because if you don't have a natural right to life, then you have only what the state or someone else gives you, and if they give it and they determine it, they can always take it back. So murder is defined as taking the direct taking of the life of an innocent person. And the word innocent is extremely important there, because it's distinguished from guilty. So a soldier killing someone in combat in a war is killing a man, but they're not committing murder because they're resisting an unjust attack on their society to establish the right to life to all their citizens. By the same token, a policeman executing someone in the line of his duty or killing someone in the line of his duty, even though he's killing a man, isn't committing murder, because the attacker, and we assume that he attacks with lethal force, is again attacking the right of innocent life in the citizens. Now, the issue of the death penalty I examined briefly last night, and again, I believe that this is up to you, whatever you think about it, because as you'll see, according to Cardinal Ratzinger at least, when he wrote a letter to our bishops, it's a debated point. So you may be for it, you may be against it, but if you're against it, you have to be against it for the right reasons. Concerning the death penalty, it's always been the Catholic tradition. Now, I know Pope Francis is totally against it, and in fact, he's quoted in the revision they made of the Catechism, which says this: consequently, the Church teaches in the light of the gospel that the death penalty is inadmissible because it is an attack on the inviolability and dignity of the person, and she works with determination for its abolition worldwide. Now, you will notice that they use the word inadmissible there. They don't use the word sin. And the reason is because they didn't change the definition of murder, which makes this very confusing, the direct taking of an innocent human life. Well, the death penalty isn't about innocent human life, except in defending it. It's about guilty human life. And the state always has been interpreted as having a right in certain instances to defend the right of innocent life against someone who would so callous about it that they would be a multiple or capital murderer. So you can hold what you want about this, but what you can't say is that the death penalty in itself is murder, because it's not. You may feel that it's corrupting our conception of the right to life. Other people might feel it's affirming it, because the punishment fits the crime here. Also, it has to be something which is done by the state, because it's not motives of private revenge. Suppose I was on death row with someone, and we had a fight and I killed them. Well, I couldn't be said to execute them because I'm not a lawfully designated authority to carry out such a penalty on the part of the state. It has to be a lawfully designated authority. Now, suppose I was the executioner, and I hated this person in addition to being charged with carrying out this penalty. Well, if I killed him, executed him, I'd be committing murder subjectively, because it's not a matter of private revenge at all. And unfortunately, when people debate it, they often couch it in those terms. So the member of the family of the person who was killed, that's too good for him. And other people, oh, we have to be merciful, which means we don't have to invoke it. Well, okay, fine, but that's not the point. The point is this a violation of the third commandment in itself? It may be in the context of certain places in Western society, but because maybe your prison system is good enough to keep the citizens and preserve their right of innocent life. But I question that myself. When you can telephone from the prison and have a little child killed who belongs to another person, I wonder how safe this actually is. So when Cardinal Ratzinger wrote a letter to the American bishops on the occasion of one of the presidential elections about whether you could dissent from Catholic teaching and still go to communion, this is what he said. Not all moral issues have the same weight as abortion and euthanasia. For example, if a Catholic were at odds with the Holy Father on the application of capital punishment or on a decision to wage war, he would not for that reason be considered unworthy to present himself to receive Holy Communion. While the Church exhorts civil authorities to seek peace, not war, and to exercise discretion and mercy in imposing punishment on criminals, it is still permissible to take up arms to repel an aggressor or to have recourse to capital punishment. There may be a legitimate diversity of opinion, even among Catholics, about waging war and applying the death penalty, but not, however, with regard to abortion and euthanasia, because you're dealing with innocent human beings. And when the death penalty is debated, sometimes the people in favor of abortion say, well, you're inconsistent. If you're against abortion, you should be against the death penalty too. Well, they forget guilty and innocent. No little child in the womb is guilty of anything. So that's why the commandment concerning them is absolute. Also, the innocent includes ourselves. So we have no right to die. That's not founded in the natural law. And people who embrace euthanasia or physician-assisted suicide would be in violation of this commandment. You know, I've lived in Oregon for 12 years, and they have a right of assisted suicide there. But they don't do it for you. You know, they give you the means to do it for yourself. You can't attack your own innocent human life. So euthanasia, mercy killing, and physician-assisted suicide are both examples of the death of an innocent person, and the prohibition against them is absolute. Now, of course, we understand that there are times when people become so overcome with pain that they don't have the total use of their faculties. We also know that you don't have to do everything possible to preserve your life. So, for example, if you were in the last few days of your life, you could use a drug like morphine to still the pain, even though it might hasten your death. Also, you don't have to be hooked up to machines, but you are the only one who can make the decision not to take a certain treatment. So we don't accept also living wills, because living wills assume that anyone can make this decision, and there's nobody designated to do it. And if you leave it up to the doctor or the hospital, well, they all need money now and they all need beds, and you can be assured you probably won't be there. We do accept durable powers of attorney, which is where you have a certain idea about what you want done, and you designate someone legally to act in your name should you become incapacitated. And because they know your ideas about this, and they know your will. So that is also something we have to consider. Also, suicide is considered to be a very bad crime, very grave evil, and yet we have a lot of teenagers committing suicide now. One wonders why exactly. They live in the most affluent society on earth. But not only is it an attack on an innocent person, you, but it also deprives society of your possible contribution you might make for the future, which you don't have really a right to do. So suicide, in former times, they used to emphasize what is gravity, because there were people who committed suicide from love. You know, they couldn't get married, so they both killed each other. We emphasize what an important sin it was by not burying people in consecrated ground. Today we don't do that because we recognize or assume that some of these people are nuts. So, in other words, they're not totally responsible for what they're doing. Now, in addition to these things, the fifth commandment also includes a prohibition concerning the motivation that often leads people to murder, and that would be anger. Remember, Christ says, "You have heard it said, 'You shall not kill,' but I say to you, someone who's angry with his brother has committed murder in his heart already." Now, that brings up the very troublesome issue of anger in Christianity. There are people who believe that you should never become angry and never feel anger. This is impossible. And the reason is because anger is one of the 11 emotions which are natural to us, enumerated by Aristotle, and they have as their purpose defending us against evil. A person who can never feel anger is easily the victim of evil. We know, however, that there are that anger can go out of bounds. So the scriptures tell us, they don't say don't be angry. They say be angry but don't sin. And they say don't let the sun go down on your anger. So anger is a normal, natural, healthy emotion. Oftentimes children are punished for throwing tantrums, and they get the idea that the feeling of anger is wrong and they should never have it. Well, I follow a Catholic psychiatrist named Dr. Bars, who says, don't worry if your kid beats his head against the floor, he's not going to hurt the floor. And if you don't recognize his tantrum, eventually he's going to realize it's not working. So he's going to try some other means of behavior. Now, of course, if a child should break a lamp or slap someone, that you can punish them for, but not for the feeling of anger. What they need to do is learn how to direct the feeling of anger in a human way. Oftentimes, not reacting immediately will allow you to gain control over your intelligence. And this is seen even in the life of our Lord. You know, I've heard preachers say things like, Jesus just lost it in the temple. He just lost it in the temple. Well, Jesus didn't lose it. He was exceedingly angry, but he didn't lose it. And also, Christ experienced anger on several occasions. I don't know about you, But it's very hard for me to imagine the wimp Jesus. Brood of vipers, who taught you to flee from the wrath that is to come? Blind guides, whitewashed tombs. And yet our society today suggests that any feeling of anger is wrong. And if you trigger someone else, that's the word they use, if you trigger them in your anger, that you need to see a psychiatrist. Well, that's not true. Now, the problem, of course, is that, first of all, again, anger is a healthy emotion. Dr. Bars, the psychiatrist I follow, lived in Holland during World War II, and he helped Allied flyers escape as a young man, and the Nazis captured him and they imprisoned him in Buchenwald for 3 years, an experience he survived. And he said, "Why did I survive when so many others perished?" He said, "Because my anger at my captives was so great that it kept the adrenaline alive in my system, so I did not easily succumb to malnutrition and disease. But it was an anger I could never express openly because it would have meant my death." So he makes here a distinction between the feeling of anger and its exterior expression. Now, suppose the purpose of anger is to help you correct the wrongdoer. In other words, if we wanted to put it in pious terms, you could say to get the wrongdoer to convert and go to heaven. Well, what happens when you've done everything you can and it's not possible for you to correct the wrongdoer? For example, supposing the person who committed a slight against you is dead. You can't correct them once they're dead. So you have two choices. One is to hold on to the anger, and many people do. There are people that are still angry at their parents or at somebody in their childhood, and these people are long gone. They can't hurt them or harm them or help them or anything. And yet any mention still brings up in them this adverse reaction. You can do that, but it will consume your character, and we only have so much spiritual energy, and it won't give you freedom to experience the positive things that God has for us. The other is a more Christian response, and for this response, Dr. Bars uses the example of Maximilian Kolbe, where you can realize this is something I cannot change. Why beat my head against a stone wall is something I can't change, so I forgive the person and move on. I don't expect them to accept my forgiveness, but I offer it to rid myself of being chained to the reaction I have toward another human being. And that's why perhaps our good physician Jesus added the section to the Lord's Prayer, "Forgive us our trespasses as we forgive those who trespass against us." Because we need to forgive. All of us find ourselves in situations where we can't correct an injustice done to us. But what we need to do is to move on. St. Teresa of Avila used to say that when she was corrected by the sisters for something she didn't believe she'd done, she never got upset. And she said the reason was because she was guilty of many worse things in her soul, and she was glad that nobody knew about those. And these things outside, well, they were troublesome to her, but she didn't let her character be consumed by them. When we get to the sixth commandment, of course, we're talking about adultery. Now, the sixth commandment could occupy class after class after class after class. For one thing, everybody's interested in talking about sex today. But what I would like to point out to you is that to understand what's contained in this commandment, it's necessary just to realize what marriage is about. When Adam and Eve were created, Adam was created alone. Remember, the animals were brought to him to be named, but he found none like himself. And God says it's not good for man to be alone. So from his rib, he takes Eve and creates Eve. When Adam sees Eve, he orders the first great cry of joy in the history of the human race. And he says, this at last is bone of my bones and flesh of my flesh. And he's named the animals, now he names her. She shall be called woman. She recognizes the fact that she's a person like he is, and she accepts this. The reason it's not good for man to be alone is because God isn't alone. God is a trinity of persons that spends all day giving and receiving without domination, without power trips, without attempts to run the place, just giving and receiving in truth and love. So the book of Genesis says, when they come together, they're naked but not ashamed. Now, what does it mean there? It means because they're in the state of grace and because they have beautiful gifts of God, and they're not tempted to domination, they looked upon their bodies, which are good. There's nothing evil about the body. I don't know if any of you ever saw the series that was on PBS with Sister Wendy. Sister Wendy was an English nun, and she did an art series where she analyzed paintings. So she was interviewed by Bill Moyers, who was a Methodist. And he said to her, well, Sister Wendy, all these paintings you analyze, they're full of naked bodies. Doesn't that offend you as a nun? You know, the Renaissance, David, all that. And she says, well, Bill, God made the body, you know, he didn't make any mistakes. And then he thinks he's going to shock her, because at the time there was a thing that purported to be a work of art, where a person had put a crucifix suspended in a jar of urine. So he says, what about this? Doesn't that offend you? And she said, well, Bill, I have a slightly different attitude toward this than everyone else. Well, what's that? And she says, well, I don't take the artist as to be saying that this is how we should hold our Lord, but that this is how society holds our Lord. So Bill Moyer says, well, aren't you repulsed by it? She says, oh, yes, one look is enough. And then she says, which I thought was very interesting, not a very gifted young man, but trying his best, is what she said. The body is good, you know. God didn't make any mistakes when he made the body. But we look, Adam and Eve looked on the body as a means by which they gave one to the other. And sexuality was the sign of that means. And because the Trinity brings forth life, they respected, too, the gift of life as a part of this giving of oneself to another. Now, of course, when the sin enters, they lose grace, they lose these gifts, and since they can't see God anymore, they try to take it from someone else against their will, and especially from their spouse. So this is where the punishment is, remember. Your desire shall be for your husband, and he shall rule over you. In other words, man tries to take the gift of self from the woman by dominant power, and she tries to take it from him by tricking him, you know. Both can't rest because they're trying to fulfill this void, but they're doing it the way Satan does it. Satan does it by absorbing the spirit from a weaker self into a stronger one. And so they each want to be the strong one to absorb the weaker self. Now, this is what's at the root of adultery. It's also what's at the root of concupiscence. One of the ancient fathers, Augustine, said that concupiscence, desire, unlawful desire, is really all about, in the final analysis, the desire to dominate. Who's going to run the place? And sexual sin is about that too, the desire to dominate. So the commandment it includes all the sexual sins, masturbation, well, even bestiality and things like that. But you'll notice it's couched in language that talks about adultery. because it threatens the union that people should have where they give of themselves to lose their egos. Marriage is primarily about losing your ego. And of course, divorce is one of the principal problems with this today. The Catechism states this about divorce. Divorce, no, it doesn't say, notice that this is a sex after you're remarried. Divorce is a grave offense against the natural law. It claims to break the contract to which the spouses freely consented to live with each other until death. Divorce does injury to the covenant of salvation, of which marriage is the sign. Contracting a new union, even if it is recognized by civil law, adds to the gravity of the rupture. The remarried spouse is then in a situation of public and permanent sin. Now, in every marriage, we do have civil effects. Who owns the property, whether you own it jointly or whatever, inheritance and that. The civil society institutes those effects. It can also dissolve them, but it can't dissolve marriage if it's freely contracted. We do not have Christian divorce. We have what's called annulment, which basically means that the spouses were too immature to make a proper consent when they had contracted the marriage. And yet, because we give so many annulments, quote unquote, many people have the idea that we're approving divorce, and they think they can always get out of it, which attacks the consent. So the sixth commandment forbids all kinds of sexuality outside of marriage because it's not connected with losing your ego and with life-giving family relationships. That has to be returned to society because the family is the primary foundation. And therefore, if any of you or anybody you know is engaging in premarital sex, that's putting the cart before the horse. You do it without commitment. You can always leave. Well, the sexual act is supposed to express the commitment. So you have to make the commitment first to the other person. It's not a matter of feeling good for a while and then you don't like the person doesn't make you feel good anymore, so you flit to another person like bee does from flower to flower to flower to flower. The seventh commandment also regards this business of domination, but it does go through possessions, material goods. But to understand the seventh commandment and what it forbids and what it doesn't, you have to realize what material goods are in our lives. When God created the world, again, he told Adam, subdue the earth and subdue the earth. So Adam is a steward of creation, but he has a participated stewardship. He can't do whatever he wants with creation. He has to do it according to the natural law. So the first part is that what Adam was given, and Eve, when she was created, was a universal destination of human goods. Everybody in the human race is called upon to share these goods. Did men work before the sin? Yes, but not in the sweat of their brows. In other words, because for one thing, after the sin, the earth resists our dominating cultivation. And in resisting this, that's when we come to the sweat of our brows. Thorns and thistles shall it bring forth to you, says our Lord. So, the first and most primordial right we're guaranteeing is the right of the universal destination of goods. That's preserved in a second right, which is connected to it, which is the right of possession of goods. But people possess goods to use and develop for the community in general. So they have a right to take theirs, but they also try to help others out. Many people in the pioneering times in this country did this, where, you'd have a famine in the land. Well, you had to help each other out. I remember the old lay brother I got to be friends with in Rome, and he was 88 in the 80s. He said, he was a peasant. And I said, he says, I so feel for all the peasants in Europe because the harvest fails and they all starve in the days before refrigeration. So we help each other out. Now, the trouble is that, again, once the sin enters, the original sin, this helping out becomes connected to egotistical domination again. So that leads one person to want to take what the other has and leave them almost destitute. So society got together and instituted a third example of property, of possession, of material goods, which is related to sanctions, where people get punished for trying to take another's goods from them. And that's property. The Catholic Church has always affirmed the right to private property. There's no sense in which we can be said to be Marxists or communists because they don't affirm the right to private property. Everything belongs to the collective, to the state. And it's kind of interesting that Lenin and Stalin tried to develop 5-year plans in farms and factories, but they were both intellectuals. None of them ever set foot in a factory or farm. And it was one of the reasons why the 5-year plans didn't work, because they had no idea what was involved in farming. They said, well, this is our goal, period, meet it. And if not, we'll kill you. Well, you have to know something about horticulture in order to make rules for farming and things like that. So we affirm that there is a right to private property. But like the right to the universal destination of goods, this also entails, because rights have a corresponding duty, remember, a duty to develop the property for the common use, a factory, a good or a service, or something like that. Also, the popes, when they came to examine this in our social encyclicals, affirmed that the workers had a duty and corresponding to their right to a living wage, and oddly enough, the popes defined the living wage as that which could support a family, okay? They had a duty to an honest day's work. The right to strike was implicitly recognized when unions came along, but the popes refused to recognize this as a tool of class warfare in which one class sought to destroy another. Instead, they looked upon the strike as a means by which one class sought to encourage the other to do its duty, what it should be doing. In other words, to increase class cooperation. And the providing of the good material service is essential to the trustworthiness of society. I know a sister who founded a religious order, and she built a building. And she told me, I'm sure none of you do this, but she told me, she said, Father, if I ever found another religious order after my last experience of building a building, it's going to be to pray for the salvation of contractors. Because she said they had a sister whose father was a contractor, and if she wasn't standing there watching them building the building, they'd immediately start to cut corners. So we have plenty of buildings today now that the masons would have been ashamed to build. I mean, the building's up 5 years, the windows don't work anymore, the doors don't close. Mother Angelica's shrine, oh my gosh, the roof failed, the floor came up because it wasn't waterproofed underneath, the whole thing. I mean, this shouldn't be the case. A person should take pride in their work of providing a good or a service. And that's why we denounce both laissez-faire capitalism, which was the idea that profit was the only motive, and Marxism, which is the idea that the state owns everything. Now, can the state own some of the means of production? Yes, in emergency situations. let's say you had a war and you needed the railroad to transport the troops. The state could take over the ownership of the railroad for the time in which the war was fought. But as soon as it ended, it had to be returned to private hands. So this means that when theft is defined as the unjust taking of what belongs to another against the reasonable will of the owner, that if it comes to obvious and urgent necessity, the universal destination of goods trumps private property. So suppose I'm dying of thirst in a desert, and I come to a well, and it says $5 for a drink, and I have no money. It would not be considered a violation of the seventh commandment for you to drink the water to save your life. Or suppose I'm paid nothing, and my family's starving, and I'm working in the kitchen of a wealthy man, and there's all this food being thrown away. I would not be violating the seventh commandment they call it occult compensation, to take some of the food for my family to feed them. The owner himself should have given me that. Well, we're almost done, so we have the last big problem. We have a right to life, we have a right to marriage, we have a right to private property, but we also have a right to the truth. When we get to the eighth commandment, bearing false witness, the first thing, of course, it affects is those in court. Now, we've already talked about those under the idea of religion. But a person has, there are many different duties. In fact, they've written books about the duties of lawyers, the duties of defendants, the duties of judges. All these people have duties when it comes to propagating a trial correctly. For example, in the Middle Ages, they didn't have lawyers defending you. So a judge could directly question you. And if you lied, you were guilty of breaking the eighth commandment. Now, we don't do that today. Our rules of evidence are different. The rules of evidence are that we're innocent until proven guilty, and we have a right to a just defense, and a court attorney appointed for us to argue our case. And if, and if in the midst of this we're asked to plead, when we plead not guilty, we don't mean we didn't do the deed. What we mean is the burden of proving we do the deed falls on the court. And the court is obliged to judge according to the rules of evidence. So even if I'm a juror or a lawyer or a judge, there's some distinctions to be made in lawyers. Even if I know a person did it, but it's not been proven according to the rules of evidence in the court, then I have to vote innocent. It has to be done according to those rules. In addition to this, of course, we have lying of our civil leaders and lying of our media, which are especially bad violations of the eighth commandment, because we trust these people, and as soon as we have the idea that they're not trustworthy, then all trust leaves society concerning authorities in general. So they have a special duty to tell the truth, not necessarily the whole truth, but the truth. And when the lie is defined to speak contrary to the truth, often various textbooks, moral books, add, again, to someone who doesn't have a right to know it. Is that's not a lie. So you have to have a right to know the truth, to be told, you have to have the commandment broken, to not tell the truth. The Jesuits used to call this mental reservation, which was you make use of discrete language. You don't exactly lie, but the way you express yourself could be interpreted in several ways. So a salesman comes to my door. Is your mother here? And you say, no. You mean here. They take it to mean at home, say. So you can make use of discrete language there, but you can't just out and out lie, because pretty soon, the more you lie, the less people are going to trust your word for anything. And this also affects our speech toward others. In Thomas Aquinas, he enumerates about 6 ways in which our speech can be used to compromise another person. Gossip, backbiting, derision. He goes down the line. Even if what you say is true, a person has a right to a good name. And perhaps one of the few things they value most is a good name. So unless it's in a court where you're questioned, you don't go all around the town telling everybody what this person's, lacks are. You have to leave them to themselves in this regard, because the truth is extremely important. And as I say, many people value their good name even over their life. So we have to be very careful what we say about other people. I'm kind of as guilty of this as the rest, because I live in a religious community and we have scoops concerning other people, and usually very definite ideas about some of the people we live with. But nobody wants to hear a constant barrage of somebody else's foibles. You want to say at one point, give it a rest. We already got the message. You don't have to keep pushing it and pushing it and pushing it. So all these things are meant to be directions for us, not recommendations. Some people say the 10 Commandments now are the 10 recommendations. No, they're not recommendations, they're commandments, which means they oblige in justice. And all these things are trying to increase in us certain virtues, which encourage in us the love of God and the love of neighbor. And also keep us from doing actions which seriously, what we call mortal sins, gravely destroy this love in us. So we can't have a relationship with the Holy Trinity we would wish to have. I hope this little catalog of various kinds of sins has helped you to see that, when you go to confession, it really doesn't suffice to just say, I wasn't very loving for the last 8 years. The priest often wants to say, well, was it an idle word or was it murder? Which one was it with I wasn't very loving? It does make a difference. And that's why the Council of Trent and our new catechism still requires for absolution that you confess all remembered mortal sins, kind and number, as far as you can remember them. So a thorough examination of conscience is very good to do before you go to confession. And it's not a counseling session, Many confessions today are the person comes in and they wants to tell you what everybody else has done to them. And you want to say, well, what are your sins anyway? Oh, me? Well, I'm not sure I have any. Well, why are you here then? Well, I need help. This is my problem. And it'll always be somebody else's problem. No. You have to talk about your problems and your conscience. So the law of the Lord is perfect. It revives the soul. The rule of the Lord is to be trustworthy. It gives wisdom to the simple. The commands of the Lord are right. They give joy to the heart. The fear of the Lord is holy, abiding forever. And I'd like to thank you all for coming. This is my 3rd time I've been to Anderson, so I appreciate the invitation of Father Gillespie and also the wonderful ladies who, take care of our needs very beautifully. And I hope you have a wonderful year.